what if like all the inequality in society, you know, all the stuff we argue about, what if it's like all based on just stuff we all assume is true and no one like actually checks, you know?
Yeah, I get that. I mean, as someone who thinks about these things, those like foundational assumptions, that's where it gets really interesting, right? And way back in the 1600s, there was this guy, Francois Poulain de la Barre, who was like totally grappling with this.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to men and women being equal.
And how people way back when like thought about those big questions, that's kind of fascinating in itself, isn't it?
It really is. It's like, how did they even approach these ideas? This deep dive, we're going deep into Poulain. He was using like serious philosophical tools to take on some really, really ingrained prejudices.
Like hardcore prejudices about men and women. It wasn't just, oh, everyone thinks this way.
No way. He was really pushing boundaries. And what we're going to see is his approach to this whole debate, it's actually shockingly modern.
Totally. This isn't just us being like history nerds, right? It's more like we're looking at the DNA of these arguments about equality, the stuff we still talk about today.
100%. It's like the intellectual family tree of so many discussions we're having in philosophy and social thought now.
So where are we getting all this from? What are we basing this deep dive on?
Okay, so our main guide here is this super in-depth entry on Poulain de la Barre from, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's got everything, like his whole life story, his major works on the equality of the two sexes, on the education of ladies. Oh, and even this one that seems kind of contradictory, on the excellence of men.
Wait, excellence of men? Didn't we just say this guy was all about equality?
He was, and that's what makes that book so interesting. See, he uses that title, which seems like it's praising men, to actually like totally undermine the whole idea that men are inherently better.
Whoa, that's slick. For someone who loves how philosophers use language, that's like a masterclass in rhetoric.
Right. You can really see the strategy there. So for this deep dive, we're zeroing in on the most philosophical parts of Poulain's work on equality, like how'd he get there? What were his big arguments? And why should someone who loves philosophy, someone like you, still care about this guy today?
Let's do it. First things first, who was this guy?
Okay, so Francois Poulain de la Barre, born in Paris, 1648. And get this, he was actually on track to become a priest. Got a degree in theology and everything.
But didn't become a priest right away.
Nope. A lot of people think he got sidetracked by this new, super exciting philosophy at the time, Cartesianism.
Descartes, right, the I think, therefore I am guy?
Exactly. And Poulain actually gives us a glimpse of this intellectual shift in his own writing. In his second big book on the education of ladies, there's this character, Stasimakis. He's a teacher who talks about how he got disillusioned with the old school scholastic philosophy.
Scholasticism, that was like the dominant system before Descartes, right? They relied heavily on like the big names from the past.
Totally. And Stasimakis, he's like, forget that. It's all about clarity. It's about reasoning things out for yourself, which is like pure Descartes.
So even though it's not a straight-up autobiography, it seems like Poulain was already deep into Descartes' ideas while he was still a student.
Oh, yeah. He probably heard these ideas at public lectures, maybe even from some big-name Cartesians like Jacques Rouhault.
That's cool. And before he went all in on equality, what was he up to?
So it seems like he taught literature for a while, even wrote a Latin to French translation textbook anonymously. Then, boom, between 1673 and 1675, he publishes those 3 equality books back to back to back.
Wow. And then things take a bit of a turn, right?
They do. So after all that, Poulain goes and becomes a Catholic priest in 1679.
Hold on. But he was just like tearing down scholasticism in his earlier work. Isn't that a contradiction?
It seems that way, right?
Yeah.
But that's what makes this so interesting. See, some folks think his third book on the excellence of men is him trying to square his pro-equality views with his religious beliefs.
So maybe becoming a priest wasn't him completely rejecting his earlier ideas.
Possibly not. The entry even points out that back then, it wasn't so weird for thinkers to mix and match bits of old and new philosophy. Like, look at Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia and Anna Maria van Schermen. Elizabeth was into Descartes, but Anna Maria leaned more scholastic. They even wrote letters back and forth.
So maybe Poulain was more about finding a new blend of ideas, not like a complete 180.
Exactly. Anyway, after he becomes a priest, he's working in parishes in Picardy, and this is where he starts leaning towards Calvinism, probably influenced by all the Protestant persecution he saw. By 1688, he ditches the parish, hangs out in Paris for a bit, and then, boom, moves to Geneva.
Finds a new home.
Yeah. Things seem more stable there. He teaches French, gets married, has a couple kids. His son even becomes a Calvinist minister later on. Seems like he inherited some of those theological leanings.
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right?
Right. But even in chill Geneva, Poulain gets accused of this thing called Socinianism. Basically, they thought he relied too much on reason when interpreting the Bible, which, knowing his whole thing about questioning norms, makes sense.
It's like that tension between reason and dogma followed him everywhere.
It really does. Anyway, he eventually gets a steady teaching gig at the Collège de Genève in 1708, stays there till he dies in 1723.
So this was a guy who loved to learn and wasn't afraid to question the status quo, whether it was in religion or society. Okay, but let's go back to Descartes for a sec. You said he was a huge influence on Poulain.
Oh, absolutely. Especially Descartes' method of doubt and that whole emphasis on using reason the right way.
Like systematically.
Right. And you see this right away on the equality of the two sexes. Poulain is basically echoing Descartes, saying you got to doubt everything you've been taught.
Yeah.
Especially all those assumptions about women. He's like, don't just believe it because it's tradition. Show me the evidence. And to really get to the truth, he says, you have to get rid of all your prejudices to have this, and I quote, clear and distinct knowledge.
Clear and distinct knowledge. That's pure Descartes.
Oh, yeah. The entry reminds us that in Descartes' Principia Philosophia, he talks about how for you to be sure about something, you got to perceive it clearly. So it's like right there in your mind. And distinctly meaning you can separate it out from all other perceptions. Poulain's using that same standard, but applying it to beliefs about gender.
It's like he's saying, okay, you say women are this way, but is that perception actually clear? Is it distinct? Or is it just a jumble of assumptions?
Exactly. But here's the thing. Poulain's not just blindly following Descartes. On The Education of Ladies, Stesimakis, remember that character? He's actually praising Descartes for taking on prejudice. But he makes it clear that if you really want to be a Cartesian, you got to be critical, even of Descartes himself. It's not about worshiping the man. It's about using his method to find truth.
It's about the process, the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. Stesimakis even says, look, I'm not saying Descartes never got anything wrong. He sees Descartes as one of the most reasonable philosophers out there, someone whose method is the best way to sort truth from falsehood.
Trust the method, not blindly the man.
Exactly. And Poulain takes more than just the method of doubt from Descartes. He also borrows this idea of the unity of the sciences. Descartes had this famous metaphor about a tree of knowledge, with metaphysics as the roots, physics as the trunk, and all the other sciences branching out.
Like showing how everything's connected?
Yeah. But Poulain, he puts his own spin on it.
Yeah.
On The Education of Ladies, he swaps the tree for a human body. All the sciences, they're like the different organs and systems, all working together.
Interdependent. Like you can't have a healthy heart without good lungs and so on.
Right. And even though he might not be as into the hierarchy part of Descartes' tree metaphor, he really runs with this idea that what you learn in one area can help you in another. So on the equality, he uses this unity of the sciences to say, look, if women can show good judgment in one area, there's no reason they can't do the same in morality or social science.
So if they can figure out science, they can figure out ethics and society too. It's all connected.
Exactly. And for someone thinking about the intellectual scene back then, that's huge. Poulain's going directly against the scholastics who thought you needed different mental abilities for different kinds of knowledge. And he's pushing back against Aristotle, who said women weren't good at practical reasoning.
So, before Poulain, if you wanted to argue for women's intellectual abilities, you had to do it separately for, like, theoretical stuff and practical stuff.
And it was always an uphill battle. But Poulain's like, nope, it's all one big system. If women can do theoretical reasoning, and most people were willing to at least grant them that, then they can do practical reasoning too. Same principles, same mind.
And that's a direct consequence of that Cartesian critique of the scholastic view, which kept everything in these separate boxes.
Totally. Now let's get into how Descartes' metaphysics influenced Poulain. The entry says that while Poulain wasn't as deep into metaphysics as Descartes, he definitely used some of those ideas.
Like what?
Well, on the equality, he drops this famous line, the mind has no sex. And he links that directly to Cartesian dualism.
Dualism, that's the mind-body split, right?
Yeah, the idea that the mind and body are totally separate things.
And that makes sense. If the mind is separate from the body, then it wouldn't be male or female, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Although, the entry points out, Poulain wasn't the first to say this. Like, Augustine had already argued that souls are created equal. And Marie Legare de Gournay, she was a feminist writer, she had made a similar point not long before Poulain.
But Descartes' dualism, it gave that idea this, like, solid philosophical backing.
For sure. It's interesting, though, that Poulain doesn't really go into all the nitty-gritty details of how the mind and body are distinct, like Descartes does. He just kind of throws out the dualism and then moves on to how the mind and body are connected.
So he's more interested in how they work together than in, like, proving they're separate.
Sounds like it. He focuses on stuff like sensations, passions, acts of will, how both men and women experience those things in basically the same way.
Yeah.
And this echoes some of the stuff Descartes talks about in his sixth meditation.
But it's a different emphasis, right? Descartes starts by really hammering home that the mind and body are different, like totally different substances. He even says you can imagine yourself existing without a body.
Right. Poulain doesn't do that. He doesn't dwell on that separation before talking about their connection.
So maybe he's not as sold on the radical separation part of dualism.
It's possible. Some scholars, like Desmond Clarke, they think Poulain might even been subtly rejecting that whole soul as separate substance thing. Maybe he saw it as a leftover from scholasticism. Clarke thinks Poulain was more interested in the interdependence of mind and body, how they rely on each other.
It's like he's saying, look, we experience ourselves as whole beings, not as minds floating around detached from our bodies.
Exactly. And this focus on the embodied experience wasn't unique to Poulain. Other Cartesians at the time, like Jacques Rouhault and Louis de Laforge, they were also into this. And Poulain actually recommends their work on the education of ladies, so he was definitely in that conversation.
But even when he's talking about the mind and body being connected, the entry points out some places where Poulain's use of Descartes seems a bit off. Like when he says all mental actions depend on the body, he kind of glosses over Descartes' distinction between actions and passions.
Right. Descartes said actions, like when you decide to do something, those come from the mind itself. But passions, those are reactions to your body, like feeling scared or happy.
So actions are more free, passions are more determined by the body.
Yeah, something like that. And Poulain, On the Equality, he mentions this distinction, how the will can choose to go along with or resist passions, but he doesn't really dig into the deeper implications of that.
It's like he knows the terms but isn't super interested in the philosophical debate behind them.
It's almost like he's saying, look, I'm using these Cartesian ideas to make a point about equality, not to win a prize for best metaphysician.
Yeah, it's not about being the most orthodox Cartesian.
His legacy is about how he took those ideas and applied them to real-world issues. He was analyzing social structures, beliefs about men and women. That's where he shines.
Okay, so we've got Poulain's background, his philosophical toolkit. Now let's see how he uses those tools to dismantle the idea that women are inferior. The entry says he combines that Cartesian critique of prejudice with a historical analysis of how those prejudices came about.
Absolutely. He starts on the equality with these brilliant analogies to show how widespread but also how baseless these prejudices about women are. He compares them to the old belief that the sun revolves around the earth, which everyone thought was true for centuries.
And then Copernicus came along and blew that whole idea up.
Right, and Poulain compares these gender prejudices to the idea that animals think like humans, which we now know is totally wrong. And he also points to the prejudice that your own country and religion are always the best just because they're familiar.
It's like he's saying, hey, we've been wrong about stuff before, big time, so why should we assume we're right about this?
Exactly. And he doesn't stop there. He even points out how unequal wealth and social status can trick people into thinking some folks are just born better than others.
Like, oh, they're rich and powerful, so they must be smarter or more capable.
Yeah, and Poulain's like, hold on, that's not how it works. So he's really putting gender inequality in this bigger context of questioning what we think we know.
It's that whole Enlightenment vibe, right?
Yeah.
Challenging traditional authority with reason and evidence.
Totally. But what's really key here is his argument that these prejudices, especially about women, they're not based on truth. They're based on self-interest and custom. Like, it benefits certain people to keep things this way, and we've just been doing it for so long that it feels natural.
Habit, inertia. And he even says that beliefs based on prejudice are way harder to change with logic than beliefs based on reason. Which, I mean, that feels super relevant today, right? Think about how hard it is to change someone's mind when it's tied up with their identity or their worldview.
It's like they're not even hearing your arguments anymore. It's all emotional. And Poulain nails this point about internalized prejudice. He sees how women themselves can start to believe they're inferior, either because they don't question it or because they're taught it from such a young age.
It's like it becomes part of who they think they are.
Exactly. And this is like centuries before modern feminist ideas like objectification and implicit bias. Poulin's already talking about how women can internalize these negative messages.
So he's not just blaming men for holding these prejudices. He's showing how the whole system, the whole way we think, is messed up.
Exactly. He really understands that oppression isn't just about someone forcing you to do something. It's also about how you see yourself, how you limit your own possibilities. And he stresses how important self-knowledge is, especially understanding your own body, to break free from those internalized prejudices.
Like, you have to know yourself, to know what's truly you and what's been imposed on you.
And he's not naive about how hard that is. He was engaging with these big debates in France about whether self-knowledge is even possible. Some people, like Blaise Pascal, they were super skeptical. But Poulain seems to think it's possible, but really, really difficult.
Yeah, it's not like you just decide to know yourself and bam, you're enlightened.
Yeah.
It takes work.
Totally. And what's amazing is how Poulain gets how much of this is unconscious. Yeah. Like, you can understand intellectually that you're being held back by prejudice, but it's still hard to change how you see yourself deep down. For the 17th century, that's like incredibly insightful.
He's way ahead of his time. Okay, so he's done this analysis of prejudice. Now he brings in the history, right? He wants to know where this idea of women being inferior came from in the first place.
Right. And he traces it back to what he calls the law of the stronger. Basically, whoever's got the muscle makes the rules.
Survival of the fittest, but in a social sense.
Yeah, and he points out that except for kids needing their parents, most of this power dynamic is totally arbitrary. It's not like there's some natural law that says men have to be in charge. It just happened that way, maybe through violence, maybe just through random chance, maybe just because that's how it's always been.
And this definitely has some Hobbesian vibes, right? That focus on power being the basis of social order.
Definitely. But what's crucial is that Poulain explicitly rejects the idea that God wants men to oppress women. Mm-hmm. He's not saying this is part of God's plan or anything. Instead, he talks about this original golden age of liberty, where everyone was equal and free.
Like a pre-fall utopia.
Yeah, but then some guys started using their strength to dominate others, and that's where inequality started. And it's not just brute force. Poulain links it to things like the division of labor, people getting greedy, wanting more than their fair share.
That sounds a lot like Rousseau, right? This idea that society itself corrupts our natural goodness.
Totally. And Poulain sees the subjugation of women as part of that same process. He talks about how war made things worse, how women were often treated like property you could just win in a battle. That's messed up.
It is. And he goes even further, right? He distinguishes between marriage and political society.
He does. On the excellence, he says, marriage, ideally, is supposed to be between equals, based on love and respect. No one's bossing anyone around. But political society, that's different. When you have a lot of people together, you need rules. You need someone in charge to keep things from falling apart.
So he's acknowledging that sometimes hierarchy is necessary.
But he's also saying that in the most basic human relationship, marriage, that's where equality should be the most obvious.
Okay, so he's critiqued prejudice. He's given us a historical analysis. Now let's get to the heart of his argument, why men and women are equal. The entry breaks it down into 4 main points, starting with the idea that inequality is just a false belief.
Right. And this comes directly from his Cartesian approach, that whole thing about doubting everything and demanding evidence. He's basically saying, look, there's no good reason to believe women are inferior. It's just a prejudice that's been passed down without anyone really questioning it.
It's like those assumptions we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. And he goes after the scholastics, who love to use the word nature to justify keeping women down, like, oh, it's women's nature to be submissive, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's natural, so we can't change it.
Poulin's not buying it. He challenges these scholastic thinkers, maybe even guys like Grotius, who was a big deal back then. He's like, okay, you say nature makes women inferior. Show me how. Explain it clearly. Don't just throw around the word nature and think that settles it.
It's like he's demanding they define their terms, which is so philosophy 101, right?
Yeah, it is. He also uses examples of women who did amazing things, like winning court cases or doing scientific research. And even though the entry acknowledges that these examples might be seen as just anecdotes, they still serve a purpose. They're showing that women are not inherently incapable of doing these things.
It's like, hey, look, here's proof that women can do this stuff. Your argument that they can't is like literally falling apart.
Exactly.
Well, yeah.
He's not trying to say all women are better than all men. That would be just as ridiculous.
Yeah.
He's just using these examples to shut down the argument that women are incapable, period.
Okay, so that's point 1. Inequality is a bogus belief. What's the second argument?
Similarity.
Oh.
This is where that famous line comes in. The mind has no sex.
Ugh.
He's arguing that the only real differences between men and women are physical, and those are just about making babies. The mind, which just gives its consent to the whole baby-making process, it's sexless. It doesn't have a gender.
So men and women have the same mental capacity.
Exactly. He says that the mind, in its essence, is the same in everyone, regardless of sex, which means everyone's capable of thinking, learning, doing all those mental activities. But he doesn't just talk about the mind, he also looks at the body.
Wait, I thought he said the differences were physical.
He did, but he's arguing that, in terms of how we think, our brains are basically the same. He points to how men and women's brains look similar, how they both process information from the senses, how they both store memories.
So he's using the science of his time to back up his argument.
He is. Although, the entry does point out that brain science was pretty basic back then. And some people, like Malebranche, they looked at the same evidence and came to different conclusions.
Yeah, it's like back then they were just starting to figure out how the brain even worked.
Right. So that's where this other interpretation of Poulain comes in, which focuses on free will. This scholar, Jacqueline Barre, she points out that Descartes thought judgment involved two things: the intellect, which perceives ideas, and the will, which decides whether to believe those ideas.
So you see something, and then you decide whether to accept it as true.
Yeah, and Descartes thought that when we make mistakes, it's because our will latches onto an idea that's not clear or distinct. And Poulain, building on this, he says both men and women have the same ability to control their will, to either yoke it to their bodily desires or to dissociate it from those desires.
So even if there are physical differences between men and women, they can both choose to overcome those differences and use their reason.
Precisely. This interpretation really fits with Poulain's whole equality project. It means he doesn't have to rely on shaky brain science to make his case. But of course, the entry mentions Elizabeth of Bohemia, who famously criticized Descartes on this very point.
What did she say?
Well, she questioned whether the mind can really always overpower the body's desires. Like, if you're super hungry, can you just will yourself to not feel hungry? It's not that easy. So Elizabeth's critique points to this deeper issue about how the mind and body interact, which Poulain doesn't fully explore.
It's like he's picking and choosing the parts of Descartes that work for him, but he's not getting into the weeds of all the metaphysical debates.
Exactly. And that's okay. His goal wasn't to be a perfect Cartesian. It was to use those ideas to argue for equality, and he did that brilliantly.
Okay, so we've got false belief, similarity. What's the third argument for equality?
Natural equality. This is where Poulain goes back to nature, but not in that scholastic way. He says that being dependent on someone, being forced to serve them, that goes against natural law. According to him, nature makes everyone equal.
So it's not natural for one group of people to be in charge of another group?
Nope. And he imagines this state of nature where everyone's free and equal, just trying to survive and get what they need.
That sounds like Hobbes again.
It does. The entry mentions that Poulain was probably familiar with Hobbes's ideas about the state of nature. But Poulain doesn't think humans are naturally bad or anything. Remember that golden age of liberty he talked about? That's his version of the state of nature where people are naturally social and rational.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Nope. And the entry points out that this idea of natural equality also has roots in Christian theology. Like Augustine talked about how everyone's created in God's image.
So even though Poulain's criticizing the scholastics, he's drawing on some of the same sources.
It shows how these ideas about equality have a long and complicated history with influences from different traditions.
Okay, so we've got natural equality. What's the final argument?
This is where Poulain gets practical. He goes beyond just saying, hey, we're all equal, and starts demanding equal opportunity. Scholars like Desmond Clark and Jacqueline Barre, they emphasize this part of his argument. He says that everyone, men and women, have the same right to truth because they have the same ability to understand it.
So we should all have access to education, to information, to everything we need to learn and grow?
Exactly. And Poulain links this to his idea of virtue. Following Descartes, he says virtue is about having a strong will, a firm resolve to do what's right. And he says that men and women have the same capacity for this kind of resolute will.
So even if they experience emotions differently, they can both choose to be virtuous.
Right. And this, for Poulain, is the basis of equal rights. It doesn't matter if you're better or worse at controlling your emotions. As long as you can choose to do what's right, you deserve equal opportunities.
This leads right into his big push for equal education for women, which is a huge part of on the equality and on the education of ladies. He's basically saying that any differences we see in men and women's intellectual abilities are because of how they're raised, not because of some inherent difference.
And he blames a lot of this on women's lack of access to good education. He imagines this ideal system where education is open to everyone, regardless of gender.
Like breaking down those barriers that keep women from learning.
Exactly. And on the education of ladies, he shows us what this could look like. It's this private egalitarian system, very different from the stuffy hierarchical schools of his time.
So he's not just critiquing the existing system, he's envisioning something better.
He is. And this puts him in this tradition of thinkers who fought for women's education, like Christine de Pizan before him and Mary Wollstonecraft after him.
So Poulain built this really impressive case for equality using philosophy, history, even theology. What happened to his ideas? Did they catch on?
Well, the entry says he wasn't a superstar in France. He had some followers, people like Gabriel Souchon and Louise Dupin, but he didn't start a huge movement or anything.
But wasn't Rousseau influenced by him?
Maybe indirectly. Rousseau was Dupin's secretary for a while, so he probably knew about Poulain's work. But Rousseau ended up arguing against equality based on similarity. He thought men and women should embrace their differences to achieve a harmonious partnership.
So that's a big split in the history of feminist thought, right?
Yeah.
Poulain saying we're fundamentally the same, Rousseau saying we're different but complementary.
Exactly. And Rousseau's ideas ended up influencing both feminists and anti-feminists. Like Olympe de Gouges, she was a radical feminist during the French Revolution. She talked about men and women being united in nature, which sounds more like Rousseau than Poulain.
So Poulain's ideas didn't really take off in France.
Not as much, but they had a bigger impact across the channel. His book, On the Equality, was translated into English anonymously in 1677 under the title The Woman as Good as the Man. And then there's this really influential book published in 1739, Woman Not Inferior to Man, written by someone calling themselves Sophia.
Sophia, like wisdom.
Yeah, very symbolic. And this book took Poulain's ideas and ran with them, made them even more radical. And guess what? Later on, people figured out that Sophia was actually Mary Wollstonecraft.
Oh, the famous feminist writer?
The one and only. So Poulain's ideas made their way to England, got picked up by some major thinkers, and helped shape the whole debate about women's rights.
It's like a philosophical chain reaction across countries, across centuries.
And the entry even mentions some scholarship that traces this idea of women's inherent dignity, which was central to Poulain's argument, all the way through to Wollstonecraft and beyond.
So even if he wasn't a household name, his ideas had a real impact.
They did. And then, in the 20th century, with the rise of second-wave feminism, Poulain got rediscovered.
Yeah.
Simone de Beauvoir, she's like the rock star of feminist philosophy. She even quoted Poulain in her book, The Second Sex.
What did she quote?
Poulain said that men are both the judges and the parties in the case against women. Basically, they're deciding the case while also being biased towards their own side. And de Beauvoir loved that quote. She saw Poulain as a forerunner to her own ideas about how patriarchy works.
So she's having a comeback.
He is. And it's well-deserved. This guy was fighting for equality back when it was really, really radical.
So to sum it all up, Poulain used Descartes' method of doubt to challenge prejudice, argued that men and women have the same mental abilities, explained how inequality came about historically, and demanded equal opportunities based on natural equality and the human capacity for virtue.
He was a powerhouse. And for someone like you who's into philosophy, his work is a great example of how you can use reason to challenge injustice.
Yeah, it's not just about abstract ideas, it's about making the world a better place.
Exactly. And it makes you think, if Poulain was right, that a lot of what we consider natural is actually just social conditioning. What else are we getting wrong? What other assumptions are holding us back?
That's a good question. And thinking about how Poulain combined individual reason with an analysis of social structures, it makes me wonder how we could apply his approach to the debates about intersectionality and systemic inequality we're having today.
That's a great point. Poulain's work is definitely still relevant.
If you want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Poulain de Barre. It's a deep dive, but it's worth it. This guy's ideas are still sparking conversations, and that's pretty amazing.
It really is. And it shows how philosophy can be this powerful tool for change.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.